And now we want to begin with our presentation to Brian Birch. Brian Birch is also about bringing Catholic values to the public square. He's the president and co-founder of CatholicVote.org, a national faith-based advocacy organization headquartered in Madison, Wisconsin, with offices and staff in Chicago, Michigan, Indiana, Florida, and Washington, D.C. It is a lay organization founded to organize, inspire, mobilize the Catholic vote through education, legislative and legal advocacy, and direct political action. Catholic Vote was founded in response to the call by St. John Paul II for a new evangelization. New in its methods, ardor, and expression. Leveraging innovative new technology and strategies, Catholic Vote seeks to evangelize American politics with hope-filled message that is both faithful to the gospel and the heritage of America's best political traditions. Catholic Vote has received national attention for numerous online viral videos that together have been watched by nearly 9 million viewers. Their online campaigns have garnered grassroots interest among all people of faith, helping to grow the organization to over 500,000 members and 250,000 combined followers of Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Mr. Birch has appeared on Fox News, CNN, EWTN, MSNBC, and has been covered in the New York Times, the Washington Times, the Wall Street Journal, the National Journal, and Newsweek, along with the Catholic News Agency, National Catholic Reporter, and many other secular and faith-based organizations. He is also a co-author with Emily Stimson of the American Catholic Almanac. He's a graduate of the University of Dallas with a degree in political philosophy. He is the founding director of the Illinois Catholic Prayer Breakfast and serves as the president of Seton Montessori Academy, in his spare time, I presume. Mr. Birch and his wife Sarah are the parents of 9 children, and they reside in the suburbs of Chicago. I'd like to welcome Brian to come up and receive his award. What's going on here? Did I do something? My policy at election time is always to say, take your Catholic faith into the voting booth. And I think Brian has been doing a super job of getting people to do that. The award reads, Catholic Citizens of Illinois presents to Mr. Brian Birch the St. Thomas More Award for Catholic Citizenship for his public witness to the Catholic faith in the education, inspiration, and mobilization of Catholics for the duties of citizenship and action in the public square, presented today, September 25th at Lombard, Illinois. Congratulations. Okay. Brian is going to say a few words for you, too.
Well, thank you very much. It's quite an honor to be here. As Marianne said, I'm the co-founder of Catholic Vote. Some of you may have seen the news. My co-founder actually was confirmed today by the Senate as the new ambassador-elect to Fiji. So I'm here at Catholic Citizens of Illinois, and my co-founder is headed overseas. But there's an old saying, as you know, some of you may know, I think attributed to Hubert Humphrey, that behind every successful man is a very proud wife and a very surprised mother-in-law. I'm not sure how proud my wife is this evening or how surprised my mother-in-law is, but both of them are with me here tonight, and I could not have accomplished what I have at Catholic Vote, or for that matter, anything in my life, without the role of my wife, my mother-in-law, and my own mother. So thank you very much. Motherhood, it seems, is at the heart of many of our contemporary debates. And not coincidentally, motherhood is also the form that God chose to serve as our primary intercessor to Him. Our Lady and her rosary is the answer that nearly every saint this past century gave to the answer of how to overcome the problems of our modern world. I was reminded of this earlier this year. Think back for a second where you were on April 15th. And no, I'm not referring to where you filed your taxes. I suspect you found yourself on April 15th, as I did, watching what we all understood at the time to be a very historic event playing out in front of our eyes. I'm referring, of course, to the dramatic fire that engulfed the 800-year-old Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, the namesake of Our Lady. I was actually traveling at the time and found myself in O'Hare as the news broke, and I was standing around, several bystanders were there, and they joined me in watching. There was a group that had gathered around the TV, watching it on TV. The fiery inferno, as you remember, the billowing smoke, and eventually that toppling of the spire, coupled with the commentary that suggested that by morning, nothing would be remaining. It reminded me, as I suspect it may have reminded you, of how we all felt on 9/11, although thankfully without the loss of life. My sister-in-law actually sent me a message. She was in Phoenix with my family. She was at a hair salon, and she said the women actually stopped and started watching on TV. Some of them grew emotional, she said. One began to cry. I remember a priest friend described his own reaction. He said, "At the risk of sounding silly, I sat there in our rectory watching the news with tears streaming down my face." He couldn't help, he said, thinking that this was a metaphor for the state of our church. Not a few people have remarked similarly, admitting that the burning cathedral reminded them of the present condition of Western civilization more broadly. This same Western tradition that inspired the building of Notre Dame now seems in serious decline, as the rise of postmodern ideologies call into question everything from family to faith to marriage to gender, justice, work, even the idea of human nature itself. These fixed ideas that have shaped much of our world for millennia, we are now told, are merely social constructs, artificial tools and narratives devised mostly by white men to oppress and coerce minorities, women, and the weak. Everything is in flux, or so it seems, or worse, like Notre Dame Cathedral, far too much of today seems to be on fire, especially the important things, the things that matter. But then, as we know, what happened next? Notre Dame Cathedral, while badly damaged, largely survived. As one commentator put it, while the wooden ceiling was destroyed, the stone foundation, like ourselves, the living stones of the church itself, held firm. Miraculously, the main structure of the building was still intact. Several of the prized rose windows, the organ, and many of the art treasures were preserved or successfully removed. And of course, a heroic fireman and a Catholic chaplain raced into the building during the fire and rescued the priceless relic of the crown of thorns and successfully removed the Holy Eucharist as the flaming embers fell from the roof. With the Eucharist in hand, he reportedly paused and offered a benediction, asking our Lord to look after his house. When it comes to the work of the Catholic citizens of Illinois, I admit I'm often tempted to focus on the Catholic and citizens part, and less on the Illinois part. I need not remind you tonight of the challenges we face here in the land of Lincoln. Woe is us, right? We are, I suppose, the Job of the states. But it's helpful to recall that the plight of Job was the result of a contest between God and Satan, a test of Job's fidelity. Our plight, too, while on the surface appears to be imposed by politicians or doctors or evil men posing as caretakers of women's health. But like Job, as Scripture tells us, we wrestle not with flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers of wickedness. The answer then to our seemingly intractable political and cultural circumstance is the same answer given by the church from the beginning: prayer, fasting, and saints. This does not mean surrender, for fight on we must. But the church teaches that suffering is redemptive. Every pain we endure with love, every cross borne with resignation, benefits every man, woman, and child, not just in Illinois, but in the mystical body of Christ. And thus, as Catholic citizens living in Illinois, perhaps we've been given a special grace. Like the Cathedral of Notre Dame, the walls and even the roof of our state seem to be falling in. But viewed through the lens of the divine plan, perhaps we ought not to merely accept our predicament, but to embrace it, where we too can be cultural firemen of sorts. With the help of Our Lady, risk the dangers of fighting the flames that engulf us. Protect the treasures worth protecting. Put the Eucharist at the center of all that we do. And don't forget to stop and offer a benediction and ask our Lord to look after his house. Thank you very much.
Now I'd like to introduce our special speaker for tonight, who's been very patiently waiting while we attended to all his business. Robert Royal is the founder and president of Faith and Reason Institute in Washington, D.C., and editor-in-chief of The Catholic Thing. His books include 1492 and All That, Political Manipulations of History, Reinventing the American People, Unity and Diversity Today, The Virgin and the Dynamo, The Use and Abuse of Religion in Environment Debate, and Dante Alighieri in the Spiritual Legacy series. He is the author of Catholic Martyrs of the 20th Century, a Comprehensive Global History, The Pope's Army, and God That Did Not Fail. He's also, his most recent book is A Deeper Vision, the Catholic Intellectual Tradition in the 20th Century. He holds a BA and an MA from Brown University and a PhD in Comparative Literature from the Catholic University of America. He has taught at Brown University, Rhode Island College, the Catholic University of America, and he has received fellowships to study in Italy from the Renaissance Society of America and as a Fulbright Scholar. From 1980, he's much younger than that. From 1980 to 1982, he served as editor-in-chief of Prospect magazine in Princeton, New Jersey. He's published a number of books, and he writes and speaks frequently on questions of ethics, culture, religion, and politics, and has appeared on various television and radio stations around the country. He's a regular, if any of you watched The World Over with Raymond Arroyo on EWTN, he's a regular on that program as part of the Papal Posse. And it's a great program. You shouldn't miss it. It's on Thursday nights often. Dr. Royal, he's translated books and articles from French, Spanish, and Italian. Most recently, the Initiation of St. Thomas Aquinas with American Catholic University of America Press, and he and the Christian Democrat International, and the Ethiopian Campaign in French Political Thought. We're very happy to welcome Dr. Royal tonight.
Well, that was perhaps more than you needed to hear about me tonight, but thank you anyway, Mary Ann. I want to thank Mary Ann Hackett and Dr. John Hackett and Kevin Edward White for making it possible for me to be here with you this evening. I'm a big fan of organizations like this, as you'll hear in my prepared remarks, and I can tell you most of the time that I speak, it is not quite in an audience as sympathetic as this one is tonight. I've been asked to speak to you about witnessing in the public square today. And I think that's something that, in spite of all those things that Marianne mentioned, that I've been trying to do for several decades. So I consider myself rather reasonably acquainted with what it means, what are the problems, what are the opportunities to stand up and try to talk about the faith in the public square these days. So I'm going to take what I consider to be the most direct and fruitful path into this subject by beginning with metaphysics. Don't run out the door, it won't last. I'm sure Bishop Paprocki, by the way, I'm delighted to have met Bishop Paprocki, who I've admired at a distance for many, many years. And I don't know if the house is burning down here in Illinois, but when you have a bishop like that, it can't entirely burn down. So. So why do I bring up metaphysics? Sounds like the most distant thing possible, right, from witnessing in public. Probably most of you are expecting to hear about more down-to-earth types of things, and I'll get to those eventually. But I think that our time in particular, the title of this talk also mentions a crisis. The word crisis is used an awful lot, but I don't think it is incorrect to say that our time in particular is a time of crisis. I don't know about a lot of you, but my wife and I wake up every morning and we look at the news, Catholic and otherwise, on our computers or on our iPads. And a lot of mornings we kind of wake up like, oh boy, I wonder what happened last night. And there's a reason for this. There's a reason for this because there's a fundamental rupture in our culture. It can only be understood, I believe, if we go to those ultimate metaphysical questions. I ultimately believe there's a solution to this division that exists in society, but it is not going to be an easy solution. And it's certainly not going to be a short struggle to get to those solutions. So we should be realistic with ourselves and recognize that we're in this for the long haul. We're in it for as long as God asks us to be in it. Now, what I'd like to propose to you may sound a little odd, but bear with me just for a minute, because there are two diametrically opposed visions that are largely in conflict in our society at this moment. And what we see, not only in our politics, but I believe to a certain extent as well in our church, is a clash of these principles in a kind of prize fight. And it's not good. It's not good in particular that in politics these two different visions are clashing, because politics, I've lived in Washington for 30 years. As I like to say, I've paid my debt to society. I can be released back into the community now. I've lived in Washington 30 years, and I can tell you that despite all the cynicism we have, to live in America under the system that we do is a great blessing of God. But politics is not a realm to arrive at truth. And unfortunately right now, because we have this profound metaphysical divide in our society, those foundational truths are being debated in the public square. And I think that's a good thing. But just think about how easy or hard is it to get to truth when you depend on it not only from hearing from politicians, but from our media, or the internet, or Lord help us, Twitter, or Facebook, or Snapchat, or the rest of this stuff that I even don't know very much about, however technologically sophisticated that may look. Now, I'm going to describe with a couple of very broad strokes, and I realize I'm simplifying when I do this, but I want to describe the two positions because we have to recognize that we are in a kind of virtual civil war. It's not a shooting war, thank God, but it's a kind of a cold civil war, or a cold, I don't know what to call it. See if this sounds plausible to you. On the one hand, there's a large group of people, and I think this probably describes most of us in this room, for whom there's an objective order in the world, put there by God or by nature, but in any case, there is an objective order in the world to which human beings must submit themselves. Now, human beings since Adam and Eve have refused to do that, of course, but it matters a great deal that you think at least that it's there. You can choose to ignore it, but you choose to ignore it at your peril and the peril of other people in society. Now, that vision, of course, is primarily religious. I would not say that everybody in America, I have a lot of friends in Washington, for example, who I think believe in moral absolutes and believe in the truths of nature. It isn't ultimately always religious, but it's largely religious. As the Declaration of Independence puts it for us, men have been endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. That's the foundation of our American understanding, or at least was for quite a while. And it's a traditional biblical view, because you won't hear that type of talk of rights at a yoga class. You wouldn't hear that kind of talk about rights if you had been born into Aztec society before the arrival of Europeans. People can still hold classical views of human dignity and human freedom without explicitly being in the biblical tradition, either Jews or Christians. But I would argue that they only do so because they inherited this, fortunately, from our tradition. And it's their recognition of the truth, at least of part of that tradition, and they're holding on to that part of the tradition that still makes it possible for us to talk about the things that have made both Christianity and a country like the United States great in the world. Now, in the other corner, there's a very different group. It's made up largely of what we now call nuns, and by that I don't mean you sisters back there in habits. I'm sure you all know this term, right? N-O-N-E-S, people who have no religious affiliation. Now that doesn't mean that they're not religious. That means that they have no formal affiliation, but that in and of itself tells us something quite important. Because if you're not connected with a tradition that goes back 2,000 years in Christianity, and then another 2,000 years or so through our Jewish brothers and sisters, what are you connected to? You're probably connected to whatever happens to be happening right now. So 25% of our population now consists of nuns, in this sense. And there are, in the single digits, agnostics and atheists who make up a bit more, probably among them amounting to close to 1/3 of the population. And that's not all. Because as we know only too well, even within the households of Judaism and Christianity, there are people who are no longer really attached to the biblical tradition. And this is why we find that there are Christians, self-described or self-professed Christians, who dispute the mere facts of biology, hence support Christian LGBT advocacy, and transgenderism, gay marriage, and so forth. You're all familiar with this, right? And this has to be justified somehow by people who claim to still be part of the same tradition to which we ascribe. And it is justified, mostly by ignoring or redefining scripture and tradition. You may have noticed a few years ago that the current head of the Jesuits, Father Juan Souza, said during the debates in the Synod on the Family, when those passages where our Lord speaks about a man divorcing his wife and causing her to marry another, commits adultery, etc. Very strong stuff that in Jesus' own time was regarded as radical, so much so that the apostles said to him, Lord, if that's what it means to get married, who would ever get married, right? It's quite ironic. Well, Father Sosa said at the time, well, you know, there were no tape recorders in Jesus' day. And so we have to interpret these texts that we get. Now, that's true. Scripture scholarship is an important thing, it's true. But one has the impression that even if there were tapes, that Father Sosa would like to see them interpreted. And interpreted in a certain way that I think we could all predict. So that's what, it's not simply a matter of people who are nuns or atheists or agnostics. We obviously have many people who consider themselves to be part of our tradition who've separated themselves mostly from the most burning issues right now. In fact, I hear that there's a candidate for president in a state nearby here who seems to have some advanced scriptural views about why it's okay to kill children in the womb and perhaps even right past the beginning of their lives in this world. But I want to emphasize again that we have to understand that the two views that are clashing are not coterminous with either just belief or disbelief. There's bleeding, blurring, there are Benedict Arnolds, there are cowards, there are hangers-on on both sides. And so there's a clashing of confused armies that goes on all the time. And just one more caveat about this broad brush picture that I'm painting. Neither do these positions exactly line up with either Republicans or Democrats or any other political parties. Obviously, there are tendencies in one or the other that we could point to, but there's even a mixture to a certain extent there. So that's sort of the background that I'd like to talk about what it means, first of all, what our public square is, and if we're going to step forward as witnesses in the public square, what kind of public square are we stepping into? Now, from my own experience, I can tell you that when you begin to enter into certain sectors of the public square, things get even sharper. It used to be the case, there were surveys actually done of this, that newsrooms in the United States were about 7 to 10% religious believers and 90% non-believers. And I've been around in TV studios and newspaper offices and magazines long enough to remember when there was a kind of a small contingent of believers who would be sympathetic to things that I might say. That's much different now. It's even much worse. It's not even the case that, I mean, we're in a country where there's basically 50-50, these two large blocks that I described very simplistically. But when it comes to what the old communists used to call the commanding heights of the culture, meaning the universities, meaning the media, meaning Hollywood, and now, of course, social media, etc. Those places don't just largely tend toward a different view, they are a different view. Rare is the university that you're going to find that supports traditional religion of any kind, I think. So when you go, as I sometimes must, to the CNN studio, or you appear on PBS, it's not just that people are against what you're about to say. They've never even heard what you have to say. They can't conceive of what you have to say. And so you start out in a conversation, it's like playing on a football team where they always give you the ball on your own 1 yard line. And the referees are wearing the same uniforms as the players on the other team. That's precisely the moment when you lift up your head and smile. Because they think that you are a small and ignorant and hopeless band who will just disappear. And in fact, they are being inexcusably arrogant and couldn't be more wrong. And that's where the opportunities begin. There's an old Latin saying, I'm sure most of you have heard it, that you can throw out nature with a pitchfork, it'll keep coming back in. And we have to be confident about this. We have to be confident that it's not our words, it's not our efforts, it's not anything that we do that will ultimately reverse this horrible situation, but it's because God exists. And the universe that he created and that embodies certain truth exists. And that is reality. There is nothing else other than that besides illusion and, for most people, unhappiness. And we see that all around us these days. A crisis literally means a switching point. It really means that you come to a point in history or in personal life where things are going to go one way or another. I mean, who would have thought even just a few years ago that our lack of an anchor in metaphysics and natural reality would lead us to the point where we can't even say what a man and a woman are, right? That to use certain pronouns about people, sometimes without knowing what we're stepping into, can threaten your job, or it can even lead to charges as hate crimes. Who would have believed that in the church we would be agonizing over firing teachers or school administrators who have publicly announced that they are involved in a same-sex marriage? And who would have believed that we would find other Christians calling us unchristian for standing up to what we believe is the plain sense of Scripture and settled belief? I'm sorry to say this, but the Bishop of San Diego has talked about groups of people like the ones in this room this evening who push back against what has become this LGBT and trans juggernaut, right, as a cancer on the church. And he's not the only one. He's not the only one here or in Rome to adopt such a stance. Now, I founded the Faith and Reason Institute 20 years ago. It'll be 20 years ago in November. I'm not quite as old as Catholic citizens of Illinois. And at the time, I'd already been working, George Weigel and I were president and vice president of Ethics and Public Policy Center, and he left to go do his book on the Pope, and I left to go do my book on the 20th century martyrs. And when I finished that book, I wanted to do something different than we'd been doing in the past, and so this was right in the afterglow of John Paul II publishing Fides et Ratio, his famous encyclical on faith and reason. And I made a rough calculation, having already spent almost 2 decades in Washington, and I said, there's not too much faith or too much reason in Washington. So they're both a growth industry. If I get into this, I'll never go out of business, and so it's turned out to be. And we've even, survived 9/11, which I hear drove $7 trillion out of the economy, mostly out of the pockets of my donors. We survived the real estate meltdown, etc. And maybe it's just my own experience of this sort of thing, but I think we all have to recognize now that we are the ones that are going to have to create whatever kinds of institutions, whatever kinds of initiatives that are going to take place to oppose this terrible crisis in which we find ourselves. And what I wanted to do was to bring into the public square the kinds of things that John Paul II had talked about in Fides et Ratio. And as I look back at that, and I've been thinking about the last 20 years and what we've done in creating the Catholic thing, and then the papal posse and the things we've been doing in Rome, there's a key passage in Fides et Ratio that all of us need to take to heart and constantly remember as we're engaged in our various struggles. John Paul knew back then, that was 20 years ago, a lot of this, the stuff that we now see every day in the papers did not exist back then. But he could see what was coming, that if we lost God, we would lose human beings as well. So he said, I just want to read you a couple of phrases. Faith and reason are like 2 wings on which the human spirit rises to the contemplation of truth. And God has placed in the human heart a desire to know the truth, in a word, to know himself, so that by knowing and loving God, men and women may also come to the fullness of truth about themselves. This is why I started out by talking about metaphysics, because you can see right here what the root of the problem is. Once you lose your moorings in reality, and God and the world He created is the only reality that there is, even worse things than what we've been experiencing possibly could be coming down the line. I don't think that forced population control is out of the question. We're already seeing euthanasia and other things that almost seem inevitable if we don't push back. There's another old saying, though, that every crisis is an opportunity. And so what I'd like to do right now is talk about some of those opportunities. And again, emphasize that as extraordinary as the times are, and don't be deceived about this, in the ordinary course of affairs, human beings deal with temptation. Maybe they live under a regime that is slightly disordered. We don't have that luxury. We're going to be challenged at every single point, and we must be prepared as much as we possibly can to fight those fights wherever they are presented to us. And we in the United States have a special responsibility. Now, this may sound chauvinistic, but I can tell you from my experience in many countries abroad doing the kind of work that I do, that America has an outside presence in debates that go on around the world. Even when the Holy Father said the other day that it was an honor for him to be attacked by Americans, it was kind of an ironic way of saying that actually American opinion matters. It matters much more than you think it does. You think people ignore us and they dislike us because we're the big dog and whatnot, and they say that a lot. But a lot of people abroad look to the United States for where the world is going to go, and they look to the church in the United States for where the future is going to go. I'm going to tell you a story that you won't believe. I didn't believe it when it happened. We have at the Catholic Thing, which is a daily column series. If you haven't subscribed to it, you can subscribe to it for free. I have wonderful writers. It's just 1,000 words every morning. I don't let my writers go any more than 1,000 words because if I did, we would be writing First Things, and there already exists First Things magazine. We don't need another First Things. But I was in Paris, and I asked a friend of mine to put us together because we have various foreign language outlets. We have magazines in 5 different countries: France, Italy, Spain, Slovakia, and Portugal. And foreign language versions of our articles come out weekly and sometimes daily. And the editor of France Catholique, I was talking with him and I said, okay, I have a donor who wants to subsidize the translations, but I can only pay for 1 a week. So I can give you 50 euros a week to do this. And he said to me, I want them all. I said, what? He says, I want them all. I said, well, Frederic, I can't pay you. He says, I know, but my people know that the United States is where the future is, and they're going to want to know what people, Catholics in the United States, are thinking about this. Now, I don't know if any of you have experience with the French, but when the French tell you that America is important to them, there's something happening out there. Look, with all due respect, let's look at this realistically, because I want you to understand this because it should inspire you to do even more of what you're already doing. With all due respect to, say, Catholics in Latin America, many of whom are quite wonderful, I know a lot of them, I'm sure you do as well. They're not a global cultural power. They just are not forming, even with a Latin American Pope in Rome, they are not a culture that is going to form the future of Catholicism in the world. The same is true in Europe. I know lots of renewal movements in Europe. You never hear anything about them because they're small, but they're quite dynamic, they're faithful, they've got interesting ideas in their smaller contexts. I think the only parts of the world where we're likely to see larger influences in the future is coming out of Asia and Africa, because the Catholic populations are just growing about gangbusters in those parts of the world. But for now, it's us. And the things that we do here have resonances all over the place. I've been really gratified for years. I've tried to make it, I can't do it every year, but I've been really gratified for years that there is now a pro-life march in Rome itself. It's been about 4 or 5 years that this has been going on. I've been to several of them. It's not huge, maybe 15 or 20,000 people, but it's there. And it now has become a presence in Italian Catholicism, which by a bizarre decision of Italian bishops, usually tries to operate through Catholic politicians. Well, Italy's got gay marriage and abortion and all the other things that have been coming down the line in the developed world. So the work of the bishops through Catholic politicians in Italy, so far as I can see, however well-intentioned, however well carried out, has been a failure, frankly. I would go to the times I've gone to the pro-life march in Rome, I've been really inspired by the young people who were there, members of religious orders. Among the bishops, when I've been there have been only Cardinal Burke, Bishop Athanasius Schneider, and Archbishop Vigano. Before his famous testimony, I saw him twice, but he was the only Italian prelate that, known to me anyway, he was the only one that I saw who actually walked the parade route with us in Rome. And there are others. There are now pro-life marches in France, and there are pro-life marches in Slovak Republic. There was even one in Germany the other day at which 5 German bishops participated. And I attribute that, and I think I'm right, to the way that we in America kept the pro-life movement alive when it looked like it had been destroyed politically. Now, the fact that we have this special position at this moment in history is both something that should inspire us, and at the same time should make us recognize the magnitude of the responsibilities that we're being asked to carry. One of my favorite writers is a French Catholic genius, Charles Péguy, and in one of his works, he's writing about the ancient Hebrews, and the Hebrews have found themselves in a special position too. And they say to God, "Lord, what did we ever do to you that you made us your chosen people?" Well, Catholics are an almost chosen people at this point. Catholics in America are an almost chosen people. And that means we're going to have to find some unusual way to witness, however modest those may be, whatever nooks and crannies of the world it may be that we are going to do this. And I want to say first that it means taking up public witness within the church itself. Now you might say, well, the church is not the public square, so what does public witness in the church itself mean? That is true, but it's impossible for me to see, after a lot of experience in this struggle, how the church is going to be a significant public presence unless it gets its own house in order. And that is largely going to depend on lay groups like this one, like many others, supporting our bishops and supporting people in Rome who want the kind of reform that we need to restore the credibility of the church. Now, with all due respect to the bishops and clergy, we can't expect the bishops to do this. They're involved in so many other things. It's going to be hard enough for a lot of dioceses to keep body and soul together. As we know, $3 or $4 billion has been paid out for abuse scandals in this country. And the chaos over that is in Latin America, it's in Australia, it's in Ireland, and it's in Rome itself, right up to the very highest levels of Rome itself. So I think we take a line from one of the very first lines that made Pope Francis famous when he was in Rio de Janeiro for World Youth Day and used this expression from his Argentina, encouraging the students to hacer lío, to raise a ruckus. Catholics should raise a ruckus. We should take the Pope's advice about this absolutely. We may not do it exactly in the way that he had in mind when he said that. But if we don't, I think we can see that the church is going to continue along a long, slow decline, not only here, but elsewhere. So there's a lot of responsibility for us to be involved, and also to be seen to be involved. Because it's not enough, look, if all you can do is behind the scenes work on various issues, of course do that. But it's going to be important for the reform of the church that it is seen that lay people take things seriously enough that they're willing to get involved in the various cultural skirmishes that are going to be everywhere because of these two metaphysics that are clashing that I spoke about earlier. Now, a lot of people ask me, so, okay, concretely, what can I do? And a lot of them say, I feel like the only thing I can do is withhold money from Peter's Pence or from the local diocese or from my parish and express my displeasure with what's going on in the church that way. Now, my wife and I have made some changes in our own giving patterns. And I live in a very good diocese. I live in a splendid parish. I get up every day and I thank God that I live in the diocese and the parish that I do. And I understand people who say this, and I would not say don't do it. But I would also say be very careful how you do this, because probably every parish and probably every diocese has many things that it does that need support, that are solid. Look very carefully at what those are. But don't allow the crisis to drive you to do things that are just even more destructive for the church. That's one tool. That's one tool that many lay people, of course, can use. And there are a lot of non-utopian, very important things that the church does. What you shouldn't do, though, is simply continue to do what you have been doing, unless, I hope this is actually the case, unless you really look into this very carefully. One of the things that I find utterly astonishing is the way that Catholics continue to give to universities that are not Catholic. Now, we all have this nostalgia for the places that we were young and we met some of our friends and maybe our spouses. But do you really advance even education in the fullest Catholic sense at a number of these institutions anymore? I personally look at those lists that the Cardinal Newman Society puts out, and I think those are the places where I myself like to put support. You make your own decisions, but this is something worth paying attention to, because education is going to be an important part of whatever reconstruction we're going to be able to carry out in the church. I just did some lectures this past weekend in Massachusetts for the Thomistic Institutes, which have been created by the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C., an absolutely dynamic group of priests who are drawing just scads of vocations from Notre Dame and Harvard and Yale and all sorts of places. And they have these student groups now, these Thomistic Institutes that they've established on campuses, where they have courses, where they have speakers come in, and these are top-notch intellectually, and they're top-notch in terms of their orthodoxy. So I find initiatives like this, and many more, are going to be needed just to get our own Catholic people educated about what it means to be Catholic again. And that's a really, really crucial point. Most of these, by the way, are lay-instituted and lay-led. I was very excited to hear that this organization itself started 40 years ago. 79 is the first years of John Paul II.
44.
It wasn't 79?
No, it was 96.
Oh, 96. Well, still. We were in the heyday of John Paul II, right? And to start an organization like this and to have achieved all the things that have been done, you may say that there's much more that needs doing, but what would the world look like if this wasn't here? So we need to be going on and on with these personal initiatives in a way. I've taken to asking people, You know, where are the Elon Musks of Catholicism? Or the Mark Zuckerbergs? You know who these guys are? Elon Musk sends missiles up to space. He's built the Tesla. Mark Zuckerberg created the Facebook. I mean, look, if the children of this world are able to create, you know, new things like this, we're Catholics. Are Catholic lay people dumb? You know, are we not entrepreneurs? Can't we put our stuff into what matters far more than cars or rockets going up to the space stations, right? Or if you prefer a more down-to-earth metaphor, I mean, where are the Michael Jordans of Catholicism, or the Mike Ditkas? These are local guys, aren't they? Okay, and then we can't be content just to have Catholicism inside the four walls of the church. I mean, even the old Soviets used to allow that. And there are going to be very important legal, political, cultural struggles that we're going to be engaged in for, I think, decades to come now. Now, I myself would be absolutely delighted if the two metaphysical prize fighters could agree to live and let live at this point. I think we all would. You know, we all would be happy if you could have non-trans fairy tale hours in the library, or we could have some schools that didn't have unisex bathrooms, or people weren't able to choose their gender. But that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen unless Catholics and others come together and carve out some spaces where there's actually going to be freedom in the public realm. No one's going to leave us alone any longer to do our own thing. I console myself. I mean, this looks impossible to stop, right? It looks like a juggernaut. But I myself occasionally think back to the fall of the Soviet Union. No one thought the Soviet Union could fall until it did. No one thought that a powerful ideology that had gotten a grip of a huge country and had thousands of nuclear weapons and a huge army could be defeated without firing a shot. Or I should say, some people did think it could be defeated, and their names were John Paul II and Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and a few others. And it happened. It happened because people, and they and others behind the Iron Curtain stayed at it. So maybe it's possible. Maybe it's possible that God has some sea change available for us in the United States and elsewhere if we stay faithful and we stay vigorous in pursuing it. And I'd like to give you one talking point about talking about religion in the public square. So I found that this has been very helpful. I don't know if any of you saw this, but a little while ago, Chris Cuomo, who's a CNN commentator, and is part of the Cuomo family, now Andrew and Mario, two previous governors of New York, both, and maybe all three of them, technically Catholics, I think, but pro-abortion and pro-gay and all the usual things that we try to oppose. Chris Cuomo, who went to Yale as an undergraduate, and then went to Fordham University, which is, as they say, an institution in the Jesuit tradition. Chris Cuomo debated with someone and said, you know what, our rights don't come from God. And it was somebody like me who was trying to say, well, yes, they do, actually. Historically, this is what. And what that person was arguing was that phrase from the Declaration of Independence that I mentioned earlier. We hold these truths to be self-evident that men have been endowed by their creators with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I don't know how anybody who's been to Yale and to Fordham ever escaped noticing that our system, unlike a lot of the systems in Europe and elsewhere, is a democracy not created in spite of God, but because of God. because we believe that God has made human beings in a certain way with certain liberties and certain responsibilities as a result of that liberty, and that we're also engaged with God. We receive the grace of God in seeking to pursue what is right and what is good. Now, I find that when this argument comes up in public, that we shouldn't introduce religion in public, I go back to this and I say, look, on what basis do you think that we have dignity? We have human dignity, we have human freedom. A materialist isn't going to have an answer for that, right? A materialist just believes that there are a bunch of atoms and there's a bunch of energy in the room here. I don't see any rights, and I don't see any God who says that there's an ought, that I have to treat certain people a certain way. Neither can an atheist, neither can an agnostic. But a person who believes in a God that created people in his image and likeness has a foundation, has an absolute foundation for why it thinks that there are rights and there are liberties and that people are to be respected. Even sinners, as we say now in the church, deserve respect and dignity because they're made in God's image and likeness. There's a very interesting book that was published 50 years ago by a Jesuit, but a very interesting Jesuit, John Courtney Murray, called We Hold These Truths. It's obviously taken from the first phrase of the Declaration of Independence. Father Murray back then, he knew what was coming down the line and there were problems, but he wanted to look at the American founding and say, there is a limited, imperfect, faint, but real natural law founding of America, founded on a certain view of God and of man. And he goes on actually to say three other things, at least three. There's some other things in that book that I think are remarkable. He says, first, what that opening phrase of the Declaration of Independence says, there are truths. That democracy, as a lot of people say these days, is not founded on skepticism. It's not founded on the idea that all ideas are equally true or equally false or they don't really matter. But there are truths. Truths like the dignity of the human person made in the image and likeness of God. Second of all, he says, we can know those truths. Now, there are a lot of agnostics who say, yeah, you know, there's truth out there somewhere, but we can't really get to it. We're weak. We're just humble creatures. He says, no. There's truth, and we can know what those truths are to a certain extent. Natural law truths. And then third, and this is the clincher, he says, we, meaning we Americans, we hold these truths. That they aren't just floating out there and we apprehend them with our minds. We base ourselves on those truths. Now, where you get a chance to make an argument like that, it isn't often the case that you can do it, but where you can do it, I find that there are opportunities then that open up because people have to really engage it. You aren't just asserting, you know, as the way a fundamentalist might write, that there are some phrases in the Bible that tend toward one direction or another. Now, I think central to all the things that we're going to do is that we must continue to affirm our pro-life witness, because it connects immediately with this notion of being made in the image and likeness of God. Just at an operational level in politics, if the Catholic Church grows weak on this, or as has happened somewhat in Rome these days and among some of our bishops, we decide that that is one among a number of other issues, people quite rightly assume the Catholic Church is not really serious. But we don't really believe that human lives are being destroyed in abortion, and we aren't really willing to make any sacrifices to make sure that life in the womb is actually protected. People are not fooled when you do that. They know that if you put that just in line with a bunch of other issues, that you're not very serious, and it's okay then to force little sisters of the poor to pay for contraception and maybe even abortion and similar things. Now, I spoke about there being a kind of a cold civil war going on in the country. And let's hope that it stays cold. And so what we've got to all do is to learn means of persuasion and to use them everywhere that we possibly can. I know what difficulties exist in the world. If you're working in a corporation or a company, a lot of people think they've got to witness the way an evangelical might, to the people they work with or people they're socializing with. That may be something you can do, but you want to be prudent about doing that, not driving people away, but actually attracting them when you're doing it. But here's what the ultimate goal needs to be. By an accident of my training, you heard that I spent a fair amount of time in Italy when I was in graduate school. I came across a writer who was the singular figure for what was called Eurocommunism. His name is Antonio Gramsci. And Gramsci, some people think, is now responsible for what's called cultural Marxism, which is the view that largely supports the progressive side of the battle that I described earlier. Gramsci is an interesting figure, by the way, because unlike the Soviet communists, he was a guy who really understood and tried to figure out how do you take control of a culture, like the Italian culture, which is so deeply Catholic. And you know what he said? He said the Euro-communists should imitate the Jesuits. It was different Jesuits back then. That during the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, St. Ignatius of Loyola and his band set out in the Counter-Reformation to teach people what the faith was and to spread it everywhere, not just to found schools and seminaries and whatnot, but to spread it everywhere, parishes, everywhere they possibly could, because once something becomes settled in a culture, it's impossible to dislodge it. If the president gives an executive order, as we've been hearing in the last couple of presidencies, yeah, it changes the way a country operates for a while, but the next president can come along and rescind it or even reverse it or do the exact opposite. But once something settles into the culture as a whole, where do you go to dislodge it? So this is the challenge, I think, for an American. Gramsci talked about what he called a cultura capillare. I don't want to get too technical here, but what he meant by this is just like the capillaries of the body feed every part of our body with oxygen and food, you need to nourish an entire culture. And that means that every one of us at each point that we're operating can be part of that process. And we've got to reverse a process that's been going in the other direction, of course, for quite a long time. It may seem impossible, but another person I take a lot of inspiration from is Pope Benedict XVI. Benedict XVI always used to say that it's creative minorities that move history. And I'm a big believer in that. It doesn't matter at the beginning how many people you have behind you if you have the truth and you have God behind you. You start. When we started the Catholic thing, we had 2,000, a mailing list of 2,000, and we had, I think Ralph Mackiner gave me $5,000. He was closing at the Orestes Brownson Institute in Notre Dame. And a bunch of us just said, we'll start this. And, if it could fail, we'll start it. We'll see where it goes. Well, we have 45,000 subscribers now, and it grows, 30% every year these days. And we're in 5 languages, and we're making a difference, I believe. So let me head toward a conclusion. I have no power to deputize anybody to become part of the posse. Not our posse or any posse, for that matter. Before I get into this, just a little side note about the name, the posse. Actually, we all started out as the conclave crew. We covered the conclave which elected Pope Francis. We had an additional member, Father Roger Landry, who now works at the Holy See Mission at the UN, so he's under orders not to speak about anything. So the three of us continued to comment. And a couple months after that conclave, live on EWTN, of course, we often tape, don't tell anybody I told you this, but live, Raymond Arroyo turned to the two of us and said, you know, we can't keep calling ourselves the Conclave Crew. That's a long time in the past. We're going to call ourselves the Papal Posse. Father Murray and I went, okay, so the Papal Posse now. Now, it's a name that could be misunderstood. Some people think that a posse goes out and gets the bad guys. I like to say that Leonardo DiCaprio has his posse, and other people have their posses of friends and supporters. So what we do is actually the highest form of friendship. We try to speak the truth courteously, but speak the truth truthfully, wherever we think it needs to be said. So join a posse, or create a posse. There's much that needs to be done in the world, and it's not going to be done if you wait for somebody else to do it. You start things, some will fail, others will go on to have great glory. And so I'm going to just conclude on this note. All of us who love God and the church are now tasked with things that in the past could either be taken for granted or that we could assume that the church or society would take care of. We could rely on the usual channels of religion and civil authority to do things that are just good for human beings. We can rely on none of that today. All we can do is to take up the responsibilities that are presented to us, wherever we find them. I can't tell you in advance where that's going to be, and I know it's frustrating when people write me or call me and say, you know, what can I do besides giving a donation to the Catholic thing? What can I do? But I can't tell you, and that's actually part of the drama and the beauty of being a Catholic at this moment. This is the time that God himself has chosen to put us in. I know you hear that all the time, but it's true. And it seems that he has a higher opinion of us than many of us have of ourselves, because I don't know about you, but left to myself, I'm not so sure I would have ever expected or trained or believed it would be a large part of my life, toward the end of my life, to be dealing with controversies in Rome and in the United States and trying to resolve them as best that I can. But he's done that. He's put us here. He knows what the problems are, and he knows how we can be inspired to deal with them and perhaps someday ultimately solve them. So, join a posse. Roll up your sleeves. Crumble as little as possible. And let's get on with the work at hand. The harvest right now could be truly great if we find the workers who can bring it in. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Royal. You've given us the call to arms. I have to tell you my own history. I'm the least likely person you would ever have expected to stand up in front of people. And yet, I was confirmed when I was 9 years old. And I felt like I wanted to be like Isaiah. Here I am, Lord, send me. And so when people ask me to do things, if it was something I could possibly do, I just said yes. And I figured out how to do it. And I thank you, Dr. Royal, for saying that. Do something, get out and say something, do something. The saving of our church is up to all of us. And I thank you very much for your talk tonight. It was very inspiring. Thank you all for coming. Father Finelli will now say the benediction. And we always end the evening by singing, Holy God, we praise thy name. Kevin, the envelopes will be picked up at the tables. I have some volunteers who are going to pick them up. Madonna and Allison are going to pick them up, and anybody else who would like to help. And someone will come on down and get them in.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Lord, have mercy on our nation. Have mercy on each one of us. Have mercy to make us do what we don't want to do. Preach the gospel. We ask all this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Holy God, we praise thy name. Lord of all, we bow before thee. On earth thy scepter claim. All in heaven above adore thee. Infinite thy vast domain. Everlasting is thy reign. Infinite thy vast domain. Everlasting is thy reign. May Almighty God bless each and every one of you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you all for coming. You're a blessing to all of us, and we ask the Lord to bless you on your way tonight. Thanks a lot. Bye.